In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint abstract floral outlines and draw loose flowers using Tombow Dual Brush Pens, a blending palette, and water brushes, as well as a Tombow Mono Drawing Pen or a fine liner. So I'm going to show you the supplies that you'll need and walk you through it in real time with some tips and techniques. So let's get started. Hi, I'm Corolla, and on Instagram I'm @FromCorolla. I'm super excited to share with you my process of mimicking the watercolor effect using Tombow Dual Brush Pens, and I'll show you the supplies that I used to get started. So first, to do the watercolor piece, I'm going to use the blending palette from Tombow, but you can use any paper that's laminated. You just need that shiny, slippery surface to blend the colors. I'm also using 2 water brushes from Tombow. You can use any kind of paintbrush that you prefer along with water. So you can use just like a regular round brush. And then to draw the loose flowers, I prefer to use the Tombow Mono Drawing Pen in 02. You can use any fine liner that you're used to using and are comfortable with. To show you this process, I'm going to use my Hobonichi cousin Avec, which is a Japanese planner made of Tomoe River paper, and it holds ink and watercolor to a certain extent very well. So I say that because you don't want to add too much water because it's not specific watercolor paper, but just a little bit of watercolor will hold well. And here's an example of something I actually created with watercolor. And you can see on the other side that it ghosts a bit, so you can see the outline, but it doesn't bleed through. The water doesn't seep through the page, which is why I actually prefer to do light watercoloring on Tomoe River paper. But you can use watercolor paper if this is your first time, or if you're just used to using watercolor paper and you like using it, and that's totally fine. But I will show you how to do this in a journal, because if you have free space like I do in my journal, it's an A5, then you can use some of that free space just to watercolor on. And just to make sure the water doesn't seep through the page, I use an ink blotter, which is a leather sheet, or a pencil board just underneath the paper that I'm watercoloring on, just to protect the page. So now we're ready to start watercoloring. I'm just going to set aside my fine liner because that's the second phase of this creative piece. And how I start is by getting out my Tombow Dual Brush Pens. You can use any dual brush pen or brush marker that's water-based, because the whole idea is to add water to it to dilute it a bit and make it mimic the watercolor effect. So what I'll do is I'll choose 2 or 3 green shades for the leaves and 2 or 3 shades for the flowers, and I like to complement the colors, or I also like to play around with different shades that bring some brightness and some fun to the piece. So it's totally up to you. You can choose the same colors that I used, or you can go with a totally different color scheme and palette depending on your taste. So what I do first is I draw on the blending palette or laminated sheet with each brush marker, just to add the color onto the palette. Then I take the water brush and push out a little bit of water, or you can take a regular brush and add a little water to it, and then add the water to the brush marker color that you have on the blending palette. And you'll see right away that the water dilutes the color and just makes it a little bit more paint-like. And you can add more color from the brush marker as you go if you need some. And I pick up the first color, and I usually start from light to dark because you can always darken a piece. It's hard to lighten something once you've already added a dark color. So I'll take that light color and I'll just add random abstract sort of floral outlines to my paper. Then I'll pick up the darker color and I'll start adding some accent type of strokes onto the piece. And as you can see, it's very random. I just kind of have fun with this. I go with the flow. I don't have a set reference or an idea of what I want the final piece to look like, and that's why it's fun for me to do this. And I just kind of go with what it looks like and keep adding color until I feel the composition of the piece looks like a balanced and aesthetically pleasing sort of piece. I don't add too much water because I don't want it to seep through the paper, so I just kind of play around with the value of each color, so how light and dark it is, just to give it some depth and interest. And if you're using watercolor paper, then, you know, of course feel free to add as much water as you want because the watercolor paper will support it. But this piece is pretty much done because I've decided that it looks great. So I take my other water brush, which actually has a smaller tip to it, and I take the lightest green shade and I start painting leaf outlines and what I want the leaves to look like and where I want to place them. So I start with the lightest color first, and I try and place them throughout the piece so that it looks quite balanced, where I would think that leaves would sort of pop out of flowers, or if it was a bouquet, where the leaves would be placed. And sometimes I leave a little bit of white space around flowers. Sometimes I add a little bit of green just so that it looks like there are leaves behind the flowers. Then I take the darker shade and I just go over some of the lighter spots to show a little bit of shadow and different types of leaves and different leaf colors. And that's it. So this was done in real time, so you can see it didn't take long at all just to create this interesting watercolor effect by using brush pens. And you get this abstract floral outline piece, which on the other side the water has sort of crinkled the paper a little bit, but as it dries it'll be fine, and you may see an outline, so it goes a little bit but it hasn't bled through, and that's what I like about this paper. And so now we're going to take the fine liner and add floral outlines, just loose and freehand on top after the paint has dried. So I personally prefer the Tombow Mono Drawing Pens, and my usual go-to is 01 or 02 because the tips are pretty thin. And what I'll do is I'll just eye the piece first, and because I'm right-handed, I'll start from the top left and work my way down and over to the right side so I don't smudge the piece, but also I'm using a fine liner so it will dry relatively quickly. And the easiest thing to start with are the leaves, of course, because they're a certain shape and you don't have to think too much about leaves. They just are. So I'll start with the leaf just to get over that initial nervousness of, you know, not messing things up and just getting ink onto the paper. And then I'll dive into each flower one at a time, and without thinking too much about what type of flower it is or what I want the flower to look like, I just start drawing petals, and then I'll draw directional lines on each petal just to show if it's a petal facing outward or inward or upward, downward. And remember, in nature, petals are not symmetrical, they're frail and fragile, and they break and tear. And that's what I kind of want to mimic in my drawing as well. I don't want it to be perfect. I don't want it to be singular lines. I want it to look more like a sketch, and I want it to look freehand and loose. So it doesn't have to look realistic. It doesn't have to look like an actual flower or a bouquet. It just has to have that floral feel to it. And I find that if you have certain petal-like shapes, the eye will instinctively point out that it's a flower. And so I don't worry too much about whether or not it looks like a flower or a leaf. I just, sometimes I use the same sort of petal shape, which I've kind of done in this piece just to show you how to do this piece in your journal. And it doesn't take too long, it's very quick, and I go with the flow. I don't go too slow, but you know, I'm also not going too fast, but I'm pacing myself and I'm letting the fine liner sort of do its thing, and I'm letting my hand guide it instead of overthinking it. And that's it. I hope you found this interesting, and if you were following along doing it yourself, then I'm sure it turned out great. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be fun, and you just have to start. And if you're going to do it another time, then I encourage you to try it out. It is fun, and you can do it in your journal, or if you have watercolor paper, you could do it on watercolor paper. Now that the piece is completely dry, I just wanted to show you what it looks like on the other page in terms of ghosting. So you can see the outline and a little bit of the color, but it hasn't bled through, just in case you were curious. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time in a Draw With Me video. Bye, I'm Carola, and on Instagram I'm @FromCarola.